Welcome to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. My name is Rubai and I'll be chairing today's session. The judges today are Natalia Diaz and Sarah Walker. And our first presenter is Katie Clark. So Katie, please feel free to start when you're ready.
Okay. Can I run this now?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I just wanted to get started by thanking the organizers here at ANU for hosting this event, and welcome everyone. So I'm Katie, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a fourth year psychology student at METHOD-STATISTICAL. This year I've been writing my thesis about the efficacy of treatments for chronic pain. In particular, we've been investigating graded exposure therapy as a potential intervention, and we've been doing this by simulating graded exposure in healthy participants. So I'll be presenting one of the questions we had, what we found, what it could mean. But first, I do want to acknowledge that Murdoch University is situated on the lands of the Wadjuk and Bindjarap Noongar people. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so chronic pain. About 1 in 5 Australians over 45 have chronic pain. And in people over 65, this estimate increases to about 1 in 3. The mechanisms of treatment for chronic pain are not well understood. So there's problems with kind of efficacy and not showing long-term results and such. So it's a big problem with not many solutions. Let's define pain. So when I was about 8 or 9, I was really into Cirque du Soleil, and I really wanted to be an acrobat. So I spent a lot of time balancing on stuff. I was balancing on a basketball and I fell off and I broke my arm, right? So I can definitely say that hurt a lot, and that experience of pain, that's called nociception, and it served a purpose, right? So being able to experience pain is really important. And that experience gives us a very specific message, and it tells us that the tissue is damaged, so don't use it, right? So I fell, and these selectively responsive cells told me that my arm was damaged. That's their job, right? That's the sensory bit. So these signals get sent to your brain, and you can kind of make decisions about what happens next. And that's that emotional bit. So pain is defined as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. So what's happening in chronic pain is these signals are getting sent, telling the individual that there's damage when the tissue was actually not damaged. So they're kind of getting sent in error. So pain is hardwired. It can be described as a motivational state. So it gives you that message, stop doing that, right? Because it's damaging me. And it triggers a defensive response. And that is, that defensive response is designed to reduce further damage. So it's super important to know what kind of stuff is going to cause tissue damage. So I fractured my arm pretty high up. I couldn't use a cast. I had this awful sling. And I remember I lay down and I couldn't sit up because I had to tense muscles in my arm and it really hurt. So that was telling me that I should stop using that tissue because it's still damaged. So this response helps us to avoid further damage to that tissue, okay? And that's really important. But when that's happening in chronic pain, that's happening when it shouldn't be because the tissue isn't damaged. So we want to find a way to intervene with that. One way to do that is graded exposure. So being able to predict upcoming events, being able to anticipate stuff that's going to happen, that's really important for survival, especially in the context of pain. So remember, one of the points of pain is to identify cues that precede the occurrence of harm. So this allows us to take protective actions. That's called predictive learning, right? And at the core of this is kind of Pavlovian conditioning. So I fell off the ball, I got hurt, and now I get a bit nervous when I see people standing on basketballs, right? And a similar thing kind of happens in chronic pain. So you do the movement, it hurts, you don't want to do it again, right? That's a defensive response. It makes sense. In the context of chronic pain, this can actually increase disability and lead to further re-injury. So we want to intervene somehow. So what we can do is create a fear hierarchy with this graded exposure. So we would rank from least to most feared, and you would work through that. So if I was looking for a career change, I might start this process of habituation by maybe standing on a tennis ball. And then when I'm comfy with that, maybe I'd move on to a netball. And then the feared basketball, that would be my biggest, most intense stimulus. And I could try getting into that. And that's kind of the idea of graded exposure. So we simulated that in our study with the cold pressor test. So that's an acute experimental pain procedure. It involves putting your hand in painfully cold water, about 2 to 3 degrees. We chose this because it's a well-established measure. It has high generalizability between healthy participants and people with chronic pain, so that's pretty good. And it's reasonably safe, so you know, not much can go wrong there. So our design kind of looked like this. So we started them off in warm water to kind of neutralize, like, so the hand temperature would be kind of skin temperature, so it's all the same, right? And then we would put them onto our first cold water submersion, so for 20 seconds, and then back into the warm water for 90, back into the cold water for 40, warm water, cold water, and that would go up, so 20, 40, 60, increasing in intensity. So we also had a control condition, so we started at 90, went to 60, 90, 60, 90, 60, so that was our control, so that's maximum intensity for 3 times. And while they were doing this, we had them fill out a 0 to 10 visual analog scale rating their pain intensity. So how painful was it on a scale from 0 to 10? How unpleasant was it on a scale from 0 to 10? And how distressing was it? So these are getting at those kind of cognitive aspects of that pain. And we also measured their pupils to look for this pupil dilation response. So the main function of the pupil is to control the amount of light that enters the eye, but it can also indicate attention, stress, and anxiety. So you can kind of imagine it's all linked to this perceptual stuff. So we can use that to kind of measure the human stress response. So we did that with a camera in a light-controlled room. We did it 10 seconds from the end of the stimulus exposure. We took 35 seconds to 7 seconds. It's about 200 milliseconds per photo-ish. And it looks really cool. So the data looks like this. It's very awesome. And then it's back to so what we were looking for, one of the things we were looking for, was whether anticipatory anxiety could be interfering with habituation. So there's kind of 2 things going on there. So the first is that we're looking for anticipation effects. So that means that expecting the stimulus to increase in intensity is going to give us bigger pupil diameters, basically. So think back to that concept of predictive learning. So the importance of knowing what's going to come next. So we thought that anticipating that would be increasing anxiety and increasing those negative emotional factors, so those perceptual factors, which could impact the way we experience that pain. The other thing we were looking at is habituation effects. So, so we're going to measure in these baselines, we're going to see whether the pupil diameter is changing. So we would be looking for increases and whatnot in those warm water submersions. Okay, so with our pupil dilation responses, this is kind of just to give you an idea of what the data look like. So this is baseline 1. And here at about that 2-second mark, that's when the light went off. So you can see that the pupil diameter decreases. So when we compared this, we compared our baselines. So those are those warm water, right? And what we found was a linear decrease. So what's happening is that there is an anticipation effect, but it's not pronounced in the ascending condition like we thought it might be. So it's pretty even between ascending and control. So there is a kind of anticipation effect happening, but it's consistent between conditions. So we also wanted to look at, is this interfering with habituation? So what we found was that there was no habituation on these subjective measures, so that's our intensity, unpleasantness, distress, in the ascending condition, but there was in the control. Okay, so we found decreases in unpleasantness and distress in our control conditions, but no decrease in intensity, so that's kind of what we expected. When we looked at habituation of the pupils, we didn't find any differences between ascending and control. So both showed evidence of habituations based on our pupil measurements, okay? So we had this decreasing linear thing happening in our ascending condition and in our control. So We have evidence of habituation on our pupil measurements, but not on our subjective. Okay, so to summarize, we found anticipation effects that were common between ascending and control. We found habituation occurs in control, and we found a competing habituation effect in our ascending condition. So what could this mean? So some things to keep in mind. Our sample was pretty small, so these are some preliminary findings, and we didn't control for stuff like age and gender. But basically, our next step would be to try and figure out what's going on with those habituation effects and why we have that competing effect. And the last kind of thing we'd want to get at is what are some sustainable options for management of chronic pain? And what is going on, kind of, why aren't we seeing that habituation? So again, this is a big problem with not many solutions, pretty much. Okay, that's my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Katie. I'll now pass it on to the judges to ask any questions that they have. And for the public, please put your questions through the Q&A button, and then I'll ask your questions after the judges. So all yours, Natalia or Sarah.
Look, Katie, that was a really great presentation, and I appreciate the fact that you used an experience that I'm sure many of us have. I mean, I haven't stood on a basketball, but, you know, similar foolish things. And so that understanding of, you know, to be able to try and break down both what the concern is, how pain works, and the way that you're looking at how that can actually be mitigated in chronic pain conditions was really quite interesting. Look, to be honest, I don't have any questions. I was quite curious if the anticipatory anxiety was found to be evident. I had some questions in terms of the psychological aspect of it, but since you didn't find evidence of that, I'm like, okay, maybe I'll just need to wait until, you know, you all have done a bit more research, and then I'll reach out to you and ask some questions. But no questions to me, just great presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Perfect. Katie, yeah, I totally agree with Sarah. I think it was the example of standing on the basketball was exceptional, and definitely, I think for me, someone who doesn't necessarily have a background in psychology, helped me really understand the context and of your research and your aims. I think similar to Sarah, I do have a question for you, but it is, I guess, quite future oriented, and so I don't have any expectations for you to have a solid statistical answer just yet. But I am quite interested to see where you see this, how you see this research being applied in the future for individuals who are experiencing chronic pain. Do you see this as being something that they could apply in their treatment at home? Does it advance clinical treatment, or how, I guess, where does the application lie?
That's a good question. So research for this kind of graded exposure has really mixed results. So it does actually work quite well for some people, but not all. So I think there's definitely room for something similar to a graded exposure model in terms of getting more longitudinal results for chronic pain, but best kind of go forward would be a combination, and that's generally what is happening now. But I just think that there might be a way to develop this kind of exposure model in a way that works better. Not really sure what that would look like, but
no, totally fine. That's I think a fantastic answer. I think again, sorry, Ruby, I'm not sure how much time I have for questions. But I found it really interesting because I am more from a design space and a design and technology space, and there have been a number of recent projects that have focused on integration of like virtual reality specifically for different types of exposure therapy, which I find very fascinating. But I'm also hyper aware that pain is not something that you can translate into a virtual space. And so I think there's an interesting kind of overlap here. Oh, tell me more.
There is So there is actually a lot of work being done with VR for exposure, especially because VR is good because it incorporates some kind of coping strategies that you can use with pain is distraction. And when you talk about VR, you actually do have this distraction. So it's pretty good. It's just still kind of being worked on. I know that there's kind of intervention strategies where they use like Nintendo Wii to get people kind of to be distracted from that painful stimuli. So that is actually a potential future option.
Fantastic. And my very final question here is, I guess, continuing that line of thinking a little bit, do you think it would be feasible to incorporate something like the pupil dilation assessment into like a virtual reality headset to continue,
yeah, absolutely.
I guess, assessment?
Fantastic. Yeah. I think so, yeah.
Amazing. Well, that's all from me, but it was, again, a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. There are no other questions from the crowd. I'll move on to our second presentation by Amy Cheng. Amy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I just share my screen. Yep, that's all good. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Amy, and I'm a third-year psychology student at the ANU. The topic I'm going to present today is about HIKIKOMORI, which is a long-term social withdrawal and job searching. So I would firstly like to thank to my supervisor, Dr. Yimeng, and Dr. Cardina and Dr. Motohiro for their help throughout the whole project. So what is hikikomori? It's actually a Japanese term for a long-term social withdrawal characterized by not going to school or work for more than 6 months. And it is a prolonged condition for that 34.7% of people with the symptom actually has it for more than 7 years between the age of 15 to 39. With the current situation of the lockdown and COVID, it's just becoming more relevant to our life. So there's quite a few studies regarding like the cause of this symptom, but the origin still remains unclear. So why should we concern about hikikomori? So for the individual, it's quite often comorbid with other psychological symptoms like anxiety or disorder. For their family, there's a 50-80s dilemma, which means the parents in their 80s need to take care of the children in the 50s, which is a huge emotional burden and economic burden. For society, there's a huge prevalence in Japan, which is a loss to the labor market. So since it's very important to encourage these people to return back to employment, it's actually quite challenging for them due to the fast changing employment situation, and their skills have been left behind. They also have impaired confidence in job-related events and behaviors, and often exhibit great anxiety as well. So the literature shows that job searching follows a logical sequence of stage, change their past experience, and job searching self-efficacy. So job searching self-efficacy basically means the confidence in looking for a job. That theory is proposed by Bandura, which just passed away a few months ago. He's a famous psychologist. This altogether leads to a reduced tendency of job searching frequency in this group of people. So in order to develop some management strategies for these people who suffer from hikikomori, we need to enhance our understanding of how does hikikomori impact their psychological processes. And that's what I've been doing in this project. The current research has two aims. The first one is to understand whether the hikikomori people and non-hikikomori people actually differ in job searching psychological constructs, such as job searching self-efficacy, job searching effort, satisfaction, and beliefs. And how does hikikomori impact on this psychological construct exactly? There are two hypotheses. The first one is quite intuitive. So it's anticipated that the people who have current symptoms of hikikomori and had past experience of hikikomori should have lower job searching effort, job searching satisfaction, and job searching belief, but higher employment anxiety than the non-hikikomori healthy group of controls. And the second hypothesis is the mediation model, which sounds quite confusing if you don't do much of the psychological research. So basically what it means is that job searching self-efficacy plays a role in the relationship between hikikomori and other psychological constructs. You can think of it as a airplane. So you go to Adelaide from Canberra by taking an airplane instead of just going directly there. So the job searching self-efficacy is like a media in between these two different variables. Hopefully that's a bit easier to understand. Then we come to the method. So we have collected 3 groups of data, all from Japan. And these 3 groups of data don't really differ in the age or gender. We have all these scales that covers everything for whatever we need, and it's all written in Japanese. So these questionnaires are all self-reported. We just analyze the correlations between these variables collected from the participants. It's distributed by my supervisors and Dr. Motohiro from Japan. So here's some statistical part, just for someone who's interested. So there's some missing data that just participants didn't fill in. We just automatically fill them in using a statistical test. And then there's MANOVA test to just test out whether there's a real difference or just like a random occurred difference. And there's also the mediation model. Remember the airplane analogy, tested by process software in SPSS. Okay, the results. What it says is that for the mean scores, the current hikikomori group, as anticipated, has higher employment anxiety, but a low job searching effort, satisfaction, and belief than other groups. But is that a real difference, or it's just something random? So the MANOVA test suggests that there's no real difference between effort and belief among the 3 groups. But for job searching self-efficacy and satisfaction, there's a true difference between current hikikomori group and the healthy group. What about the past hikikomori group? The results basically demonstrate there's no significant difference between current and past and healthy. So it's quite confusing whether this past hikikomori group is more like the health people or healthy people, or like the current hikikomori condition. The statistical test generally suggests that for all the other constructs, the past hikikomori group is quite like the healthy people, but for employment anxiety, they're like the current condition of hikikomori. So that suggests that despite being anxious in employment, this group of people still being very brave and stepped out into their workplace and start to re-engage in work. So that's quite encouraging. Lastly, the mediation model just says that job searching self-efficacy does play a mediation role. The hikikomori does not have a significant direct impact on job searching effort and satisfaction or employment anxiety, but there's an indirect effect why its relationship with job search self-efficacy. What this suggests is that job searching self-efficacy does play a protective role and reduces employment anxiety. So future clinicians can develop some strategies based on how to improve their job searching self-efficacy to promote more people return back to the workforce. Lastly, there's some limitations for the whole project. The first one is that there's some assumptions in the statistical model that hasn't been met, which means we can probably adapt a better statistical model that fits more with the data, and that will probably explain why this POST-HIKIKOMORI group didn't match with either the groups and what the true difference is within that group. Also, the control group was actually collected 10 years after the POST-HIKIKOMORI group. So the control group was collected last year in 2020. But, you know, with the situation of COVID and everything, their psychological states might have changed, which makes the whole difference. Yeah, and it's really worth to investigate whether the COVID situation leads to the higher prevalence of hikikomori or not really, or because like these people realize that, oh, it's just a normal situation of staying at home, and they might be encouraged and step back and re-engaging workforce. So it'll be quite interesting to do some future research like this. That's everything for me today. And are there any questions at all?
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great that both of you were within your 10 minutes. I'll pass it on to the judges for questions. And then please, if you're attending the session and you have questions, just put it into the chat or the Q&A box. Sarah or Natalia, this is your time to ask questions, please.
I feel like I went first last time, Natalia. So if you want to go first this time, you can.
I was just thinking that. Okay, Amy, I have, again, perhaps a broad question for you, but with this discussion of hikikomori, apologies if I said that incorrectly, in terms of this discussion of understanding its relationship with job search, self-efficacy, etc., where do you see the responsibility of care kind of lying? Do you think that efforts should be focused more so on the individual in terms of developing care practices or management practices that enable them to develop job searching self-efficacy in another manner? Or do you think that there's responsibility on employment services and more social systems in order to ensure that job searches are still accessible to people who might be experiencing hikikomori?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally there are two ways that target at either the family or the individual. So for the individual, it's about training them into capable of doing some like job related like interviews or like just some simple skills. And what this strategy is mainly targeted is that they reduce the anxiety just by telling, by making the patients aware that it's not such a big deal in the workforce. So you can just like cooperate with your mates, and it's not going to cause a huge anxiety or depression to you. But that's like a very gradual process. So people might enter the workforce for just a couple of days at first and see how they feel, and then the clinicians will assess their mental state and give them further suggestions to whether they should go back or they should just like have a few days of relaxation. So this is quite a long process. It's more generally takes more than like 4 years to do the entire practice. And for the families, because they stay at home and their families are probably the only ones they get in contact with, it's very important to make the family know how to support them and how to make them recover from situations. But generally, Japan has been quite supportive to this group. Yeah, they don't really need to worry about money or anything because they got this government's fund for this group of people. Yeah, that's the two aspects.
Perfect, thank you. Again, I also just want to comment, another very wonderful presentation. So thank you so much for all the effort that you put into that. Could you remind me just very quickly what your two research aims were? I think I had a question about one of them, but I can't quite remember the wording.
Yeah, the first one was just about, is there a difference between their psychological state? And the other one is, what's the underlying mechanisms for how the hikikomori impact on their following psychological constructs?
Yeah, perfect. So that definitely reminds me of my question, which was oriented around your second research question. And again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but in your methods, it seemed like you were taking a very qualitative perspective, sorry, a quantitative perspective. I was just wondering if you had been interested in, or perhaps other researchers had already conducted a qualitative assessment of what that experience is like.
Yeah, there are a few case studies of that. Yeah, so the experience is just like they figure that the future is kind of like dark, and they feel like they don't want to do anything, and there's no purpose, there's no point of contact with people. I can live by myself. Yeah, that's the aspect. And I remember quite clearly about one thing that helped them to recover from hikikomori, which is the death of their parent. So the son, he's in his like 40 or 50s, and being home for like 7 or so years, and suddenly he's been taking some clinical practice to recover, but he still wasn't able to step out. But then his dad just passed away, and he was conducting all these funerals and stuff, and he just didn't feel that he can stay at home anymore, and there's a huge responsibility for him to take. That's an opportunity for him to actually recover, although it's quite a painful experience. Yeah,
certainly. Yeah, I think there's a fascinating relationship there with the concept of responsibility and having an opportunity to kind of take on work, and I'm sure that even though it's a challenging situation, is perhaps self-affirming.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Those are all of my questions. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. That was, yeah, it was a really interesting presentation. Look, my first question is actually, I'm really quite curious. Is this something that is mainly occurring within Japan, or is this just where there has been a big, prevalence of the government and other agencies investigating into this type of occurrence? Or is it something, is it mainly Japan, or does this happen elsewhere as well?
Yeah, there's quite a huge debate around whether this is a cultural specific symptom or it's just something that can occur everywhere. So I think because of the Japanese culture, like promoting a more collective society that brings more pressure to the people who just doesn't want to engage in the society, that makes this phenomenon more prevalent. But there's also researchers looking into other countries, but the cases were quite small, like only like 8 or 10 cases. So it's not clear yet whether it's just because there's only that few cases, or just there's less attention paid to this phenomenon that didn't bring out the other cases among other countries. So there's still investigating into this. But it's actually quite relevant to the Japanese culture and to the kind of the animation aspect, because there's a lot of things you can do online in Japan, and people just doesn't feel that you have to step out, engage in social life. Yeah, that's another thing as well.
Yeah. kind of leads into actually my second question is, you know, you were talking about looking at like self-efficacy, the belief, satisfaction, that kind of stuff. And I was wondering if any consideration had been given to like identity and, you know, identity disconnects or, you know, incompatibility of identity. So whether the people who were experiencing this, you know, were kind of feeling as if they didn't belong to that identification of, you know, employee of a certain organization or student, and whether that had been looked into at all in terms of, yeah, is identity playing a factor in some of this as well?
Yeah, so social identity definitely play a role in the unemployment people, like how they withdraw from the from their workplace. But it's not exactly the same with HIKIKOMORI, because like they don't necessarily stay at home and not going anywhere, the unemployment people. So that's the literature I've been looking at, so just about unemployment aspect. But because there's not that much research into HIKIKOMORI in the Western countries, connecting social identity with this phenomenon is quite rare, and I haven't been really reading much into this kind of literature. Yeah, but I believe it's going to be very interesting to look at it, and it might play a significant role and explain how this happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's the thing with research, isn't it? Anyhow, there's always, you know, you go, oh, I wonder about this, and then there's so much more to look at and consider, and not nearly enough time to do it in. So yeah, completely understandable. But yeah, no, great job, really well done.
Thank you for that.
Ruba, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sarah. I was just saying wonderful. Thank you, Amy. It looks like there's no more questions, so I'll move to end the session. I want to thank Katie and Amy for their presentations, and Natalia and Sarah for their judging. And to the crowd, thank you so much. Please do attend more sessions. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.